The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
All right, you are back in the House of Mystery, and for the interview we have the author of A Murder in My Hometown, Rebecca Morris. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Ellen Julie. I look forward to talking to you.
Well, yeah, now, this is quite the book. How did you get involved in this story and enough to make you actually want to write a book?
Well, my 50th high school reunion was looming, and, I've written 7 other true crime books in the last decade or so, and I just got to thinking about how I remembered from my childhood and my teenage years that a classmate was murdered when I was a senior in high school, and it had, as far as we knew, it had never been solved. And so I decided to look into it. There were really no family members left of the boy, but I couldn't have done a book unless the man who was the district attorney in Corvallis, Oregon at this time was still around, and also the 2 original detectives, because it's nice to have some original sources when you're working on a story. So the story was in 1967 in Corvallis, Oregon, which is a college town, that a classmate of mine was found in the Willamette River, at that point one of the most polluted rivers in North America. And what happened over a series of a few weeks is they determined he'd been to a party the night before and had never arrived home. In 1967 and 68, of course, there weren't the forensic tools that there are today, and they never made an arrest. They had a suspect, but it just kind of lingered. When I began to look at this in 2017, I have always gone back to my hometown over the years because my parents were still there for many years. But I went back and started, talking to other classmates and realized that there was a good number of us who thought that the case had never been solved because this boy, Dick Kitchel, was from the other side of the tracks in Corvallis. And Corvallis was very much split between those of us who were the children of college professors, as I was, and then the others who, had working class backgrounds. And so I just decided to look into it, and I thought there was enough of the story and a universal story that, I've heard people all over the world who said, that could have been my hometown. Something like that happened when I was a teenager. And so that it might have some appeal to people who don't live in Oregon.
It's interesting, and I think you mentioned this, and we should mention it to the listeners about the 1967 was quite a year, for all of the things going on with the Viet Nam War and the presidential campaigns, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy being shot. That really had the attention of most of the people, too, didn't it?
Well, it did, and that became, a pretty pivotal angle for me, frankly, in framing this story, is that 1967-68, when this played out, was, Lyndon Johnson, who was president, called it the nightmare year because of Viet Nam, because of later in the summer in 68, the protests of the Democratic National Convention, the assassination of King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, who'd just been campaigning in Corvallis a few days before he was assassinated in Los Angeles. He was campaigning for the primary in Oregon. And a number of us had been to see him and, had our first march, after King was assassinated. And America just kind of exploded in 1968, and I guess it became a kind of metaphor for me as far as how America was changing and how this college town changed.
Yeah, pretty definite times. What did you know about this Dick Kitchel? Was he a popular kid? Was he what do we know about him?
Mm-hmm. Well, we went to different grade schools, and in Corvallis, like many other hometowns, what grade school you went to sort of determines who your friends are for the rest of your life, or certainly through high school. But we were at the same junior high school, and I know he was in a class or two of mine. He tended to, in high school, take the more a different kind of class, not college placement classes, which a lot of us were in. He was taking shop classes, which is great. He was going a different path. He wasn't a scholarly boy, but he'd been, he was a nice kid as a child, and I talked to many, many friends of his, particularly boys who'd lived in his neighborhood and rode bikes with him, who were in Cub Scouts with him, who were on Little League baseball teams with him, who still to this day, more than 50 years later, refer to him as Dickie, his childhood name. They still call him Dickie. And he was a sweet kid. He had a difficult childhood. His parents had been divorced. He was an only child. He was shuttled back and forth between Olympia, Washington, where his mother moved back to her hometown, and then his father in Corvallis. There were numerous stepmothers. There were step-siblings. I think he kind of got lost in the shuffle. His father owned a shoe repair shop in Corvallis, very much, working class. And I remember seeing Dick changed. I saw him from a distance at junior high and high school. And when he became, one of the tough kids, you could see it, and you could see it in who he was hanging out with. You could see it in, the cowboy boots he wore and his favorite jacket that he never took off, and just looking tough, smoking, sneaking cigarettes, and I learned an awful lot doing this book about the parties that he and his group went to, which I had no clue that, you could find a party with alcohol that people in their 20s would throw for high school students, and they'd slip the hosts a few dollars for the alcohol. I was probably home, doing my homework.
Yeah.
But he was well liked, and he actually had friendships across many groups. He was dating a cheerleader. Her parents wouldn't let her actually go out and date, but he was allowed to come over to their house, and they'd sit on the couch and talk. But he also, had some girlfriends that could ride in his car with him and go to parties, but he was, he had friends in kind of all the populations that you find in a high school.
Yeah. Well, so after this, he went missing. What was the initial reaction in town? Were they scared that something happened, or did they just think, well, he's just, gone somewhere?
Well, it was sort of shrugged off. His own father and stepmother shrugged it off and did not report him missing for several days to the police department, because Corvallis is just about an hour from the Oregon coast, and Dick was with, sometimes with friends who they just would drive, to the coast for overnight or a day or two, and so his own father wasn't too concerned. They finally went to the police department. There were certainly rumors in town that, whatever happened, he got what he had coming. he was known, and his family was known to the police department because they'd been to the Kitchel house to break up fights between he and his father. So his father was a suspect for, a brief time. But fairly quickly they found that he'd been to this party on the last night he was seen, which was in October 67, and they found that he didn't have his own car. He'd cracked it up in an accident a week or two before, so he needed a ride, and he and a couple other boys had accepted a ride from an older man, meaning in his 20s, who was at this party. And Dick was the last person that was allegedly dropped off, and the driver, Doug Hamblin, said that he left Dick downtown Corvallis, that he was going to walk the rest of the way home or something. And so he was an early suspect and a long time suspect. But basically they needed to find out, did Dick ever get home that evening, or had he disappeared that night? And of course they didn't know for 11 days until his body surfaced in the Willamette River that he'd been murdered. So by the time they were looking at suspects and looking at the car he rode in and the place where there'd been the party, it was kind of, any evidence was gone, if there ever was any evidence.
Right.
And when they did look at the guy's car, it was 11, 12 days later, and, they didn't seize it like they would today. And, their one forensics was still pretty elementary, so there was really no evidence of what had happened.
Mm. So when he was, his body was spotted, and people found out that he's been murdered. What was the reaction then? Was it any better, or was it still kind of, he's just he was kind of not the best kid, or he's from a poor part of town, so it didn't matter? Or
well, there were big headlines. Murder was an exceptional crime in Corvallis, so it was huge front page news for a few days, and the headline was "Missing Prep Student Found Murdered." Well, prep student meaning something different than, just a high school class student. So there was coverage in the local paper. I remember very, very vividly that, so he was found on a Saturday by two boys who were fishing off a dock in the Willamette River, and his body had been submerged for 8 or 9 or 10 days, and then, came to the surface and was floating. The Willamette River actually runs north, so he was floating up the river, and they spotted it and ran for help. I remember very vividly that 2 days later, on the first day of class, after his body was found on Monday, that it was announced on the public address system at the school. You know how every morning in every classroom in the high school and the school you could hear the same announcements.
Yeah.
And I don't remember that they used the word murdered, but I remembered their mentioning that he'd been found dead, which, I don't think they would do that today. And I was also very intrigued with thinking about how differently, today the media would go to the high school, would interview his friends, would kind of help try to find out what had happened. There would be counselors at the school, wouldn't there? There was nothing like that.
Right.
There was just this boy had been murdered. The police came to the school and talked to some of his friends. A lot of interviews were done, away from the school. It was just a very different time. And most people that I talked to said, their parents didn't talk about it with them. They didn't want to know, how his friends were reacting, and a lot of the students went to the funeral by themselves. I think, the parents weren't very involved in this.
Yeah, it's too bad. Now, what did the police do in their investigation? Was it pretty thorough? Were they really involved in it, or did they just sort of kind of push it aside?
Well, I think they gave it their all, and I looked. I spent 2 years looking at it, and with talking to the original detectives, and while Dick's friends might have felt that it wasn't really pursued because he was from the wrong side of the tracks, I found a lot of evidence that wasn't true, that they gave it their all, that they constantly, these two detectives constantly went back to the DA to say, we think we have enough to bring charges, we know who did it. And, then and now, prosecutors are pretty conservative about what cases they bring. They want to win. They know what juries will, when they will indict and when they won't indict. And the DA just didn't think that the proof was there. There was an awful lot of, incriminating evidence. And, the last person to see him, that's always important in a case. Doug Hamlin being the last person to see Dick and giving him a ride. And then things like, Dick's parents said the first night, where's his jacket, his beloved jacket he never took off. Well, it turned out it had been left in the suspect's car. He told police he didn't know who it belonged to. It was the size of a child. Dick was rather a smallish boy, even at age 17, and he'd given the coat away. So they got back the coat, but what they determined is that he'd been in a pretty good fist fight, and there'd been an altercation at the party house where he'd been, but he wasn't wounded there. But that at the time of his death, there'd been a fist fight, and then he'd been strangled, not with bare hands, but with a piece of cloth, perhaps with the coat, with somebody's elbow, and then he'd been, put in the river. So it certainly pointed to this last person who saw him, but the DA didn't think there was enough to bring charges. But it's true that the investigation, slowed and finally kind of died off within a year of Dick's murder. They didn't have anywhere really to go with it. But I thought that they, I could see from the original police report the extent they went to talk to people, and to get, to give polygraph tests. This fellow who was the best suspect and was, failed 3 polygraphs, and even in those days that was pretty damning information.
Yeah. What do we know about that guy, Doug Hamlin? Like, was he in a lot of trouble? Was he kind of a bad character, or was he upstanding? Like, do we know anything?
Well, we do. We know a lot, and I talked to a lot of people who knew him, and one of his ex-wives was very, very forthcoming. So he had graduated from the same high school, or he'd attended the same high school. I don't think he ever graduated. So he was 22 to Dick's 17, and he'd already been married and divorced and had an infant child. He'd been in some trouble himself with the police. He hung around, these parties. Now, why these mid-20-year-olds liked hanging out with 16, 17-year-olds, I don't know. I think what they had in common was alcohol. But Doug had a rather unusual childhood himself. His mother had been married 8 times,
Oh.
twice to the same person, and she was very defensive of him, and he was very protective of her. So he'd had a lot of ups and downs with jobs he had or lost. And
His mother sounds like Liz Taylor.
oh my God! Well, she was actually quite a beloved character in Corvallis. She was a taxi dispatcher. She'd worked at some bars, and she was a rather well-known character. And then Doug's father, who was one of the many husbands, was also kind of a character. My favorite story about him was that he'd lost his driver's license because of DUIs and everything. So one night he wanted to go down to the Peacock Tavern on 2nd Street in Corvallis, which is still there. And so he drove his tractor, since he couldn't legally drive a car down there. And he parked the tractor and, proceeded to get drunk, and then was arrested driving the tractor away from the tavern a few hours later, and was represented by the most famous, defense attorney in Corvallis, and who got him off. But it's stories like that from the 1950s that are just so colorful, say so much about a small town.
Yeah.
And some of the people that inhabited it. But it was, what I really loved about also doing this book is not only looking into the mystery of what really happened to Dick Kitchel, but we grew up, he and I and the others. This was the Cold War, and this is when in grade school, we practiced duck and cover exercises, and there was a good chance Corvallis was on Russia's map, because we had an Air Force station just 10 miles outside of town with a lot of radar and things that were important to the country at that time. It wasn't a base with tens of thousands of soldiers and airplanes, but it had important equipment to be the place that would see rockets, coming into the United States. So it was a target, a dare, and it was just another time and place. It was a place with basically no minorities in Corvallis, despite being a university town, but very much a class-conscious town with people with, it was the haves and have-nots, the blue collar and the white collar.
Now, did this Doug Hamlin have a record of assaults, or did he get into a lot of fights? Did he, carry a gun? Like, what did he have a temper or violence?
He had a temper, and he liked to drink a lot. He was a hunter. A lot of these boys grew up hunting and fishing in Oregon. He'd had some scrapes, mostly brawls. I don't think he had a police record per se, but he was known to the police like a lot of people were, and like Dick was for getting in fist fights. But in those days, like they did, they might police would arrive at the house or the bar and sort of extinguish what was going on, and that was that. And you could, in fact, escape arrest. So he was known as a bit of a troublemaker, and had some wild years.
Yeah. What did the police think of his motive? Did they have a motive or an idea of why he would kill this younger kid?
Well, there really was no motive. If Dick had his car that night and hadn't ridden with him, this wouldn't have happened. If Dick had gotten a different ride, this wouldn't have happened. It wasn't anything Doug Hamblin planned. But something happened in the car. So Dick had had an altercation with somebody at the house where the party was going on, but it wasn't Doug. Dick had arrived drunk and then drank some more, and so his altercation wasn't with Doug. But what they surmised is that when reportedly Dick wanted to be let off downtown and not have Doug Hamblin take him all the way home, which was south across the river, south of Corvallis, then Dick wouldn't get out of the car. So the passenger side door was broken, and if somebody was in the passenger seat, they would have to be, slide across the bench seat of the car, if you remember bench seats. Well, at some point, Dick had moved from the back seat of the car when they were letting the other boys off. He'd moved to the front seat, and Doug told the police Dick wouldn't get out of the car, and he dragged him across the seat, but that Dick was alive and well when he left him standing on the street corner. If he was pulling Dick out of the car, and Dick didn't want to be pulled out, they must have gotten into a fist fight right then. And maybe by accident, Doug Hamblin put his arm and elbow around Dick's neck and into a chokehold. It's very likely it happened like that. I don't know if in 1967 would that be manslaughter charge rather than murder, but it was a chokehold. But Dick also had a lot of bruises around his eyes and on his throat. So there had been a good fight, and then he died in the chokehold.
Okay, so he died of the strangulation then, eh?
Yes.
Wow, that's crazy. So now this has gone on, and it's still officially a cold case. They've never prosecuted this, have they?
They had never prosecuted it, and in the 60s there just was the determination there wasn't enough evidence to make any arrest, including Doug Hamblin. Finally, Dick's father had been cleared by a polygraph and everything, but it's so fascinating to read police reports from those days, because the detectives would go into the shoe repair shop and talk to Dick's father and stepmother, and they would get yelled at, and they wanted to be left alone. They weren't really. His father never ever called the police once to ask, okay, what's going on with the investigation into my son's murder. Never once. And they finally took a polygraph, and he was cleared. So Doug Hamblin, came and went from Corvallis. He remarried a few times. He got into a little bit of trouble over the years. So then, to fast forward, it's considered an unsolved case, a cold case, and along about 2012, it was assigned to a new detective, a young cold case detective in Corvallis, who looked at it, and he decided he could charge Doug Hamblin. He was going to, after 50 years, make an arrest. And then he found out that Doug Hamblin had just died. So he still wanted to find justice. He still wanted, you can still pursue you could still take it to a grand jury even if the suspect is dead. But Benton County just decided that it wasn't worth it, and there wasn't the money. And so I don't think it's anything giving anything away to say that the status of the case is now, it's called closed conditionally, meaning that on the death of the best suspect, it's been closed. But I think it's such a great story about how that took, 50 years to get to that, and what was it like to investigate a murder, 50 years ago? It was so different from anything we see on television now or anything we read about. And these people, there are all kinds of characters in this book. There's the people who hosted the party and what their lives were like, and Dick's friends and the girlfriends he dated then, and we all grew up, and he didn't get to, but I heard from hundreds of people when I started this book that they had never, ever forgotten him. And, of course, we were never told what happened. It was never printed that, we're suspending the investigation because it's not going anywhere. Or even in 2014, the best suspect has died. We never knew a thing. So, if anything, that's what this book does. It updates us about, whatever happened to this case, and what happened to the boy that we knew.
So what do you want people to get out of the book when they read it?
Well, I do think it's a very universal story. I've been contacted by lots of people who said, there was a kid in my school who died, and we never found out what happened. And it's also, it's very much about a time and place, a college town in the late 1960s, when, as we discussed, the world was changing, and this murder and it being unsolved was happening at the same time, and there were students that were, we graduated late May, early June of 1968 with this on, with this was on our minds. But there were students that were leaving for Vietnam who came back. There were students who did not come back from Vietnam that were in my class. There were students I talked to who now can reveal, what they were really like in high school, and that they knew that they were gay and couldn't come out, and the world was changing for us at exactly the moment that this happened. So our town changed, and we changed, partly because of this unsolved murder, partly just because America was, there were so many wars at home, as well as, the infamous living room war in Vietnam. It's just to really, there was just so much happening around the country. And also, they thought, his friends thought his death was ignored. And, but, I found out it wasn't. It was such a dramatic year in America.
Yeah, well, thank God it's all stable and nothing's happening now. I mean,
yes.
Everything's
well put, Al.
Yeah, everything's boring now. We just all do nothing.
Yeah.
So, and there's no living room battles anymore. Yeah.
But, crime wasn't. It was again. I think it was rare in a lot of American towns, and now it isn't, and we see it. We've learned a lot more about how crime is investigated, and this was, this murder was played out during, it was just a different time, and frankly, I've always had this view of Corvallis as very kind of idyllic, and what I found out doing the book is that it wasn't. There were lots of people with problems. There was lots of class differentiation. people had secrets just like they do now.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just a different life, different time, but there were still, people are people, and...
people are people, yes.
Yeah, it goes on small towns or big cities. It's just, I think we're more exposed to these things now, and the internet and everything just blew the world up, It's sort of, we realize who's living around us now more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a quote at the front of the book from the from the movie Pleasantville, the 1998 movie, where, the teenagers are sort of trapped in the black and white world of television in the 1950s, and that's how I sort of always saw Corvallis is this, but nothing is really truly idyllic. There's always something behind what you see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the idea of the small town, being all perfect is just not really. Yeah. It's just not real. But it's something we always thought. It's
what we thought. I had, it sounds like I was pretty naive, and I guess I was, but I had classmates tell me when I was working on the book that they couldn't wait to get out of Corvallis. They couldn't wait to move away. They couldn't wait to go to college. And, their hometown was not the same as mine. We saw it differently. And I have to say, I'd never thought of that till I was working on this book, that not everybody, had the same experience. Not everyone has the same experience in their own hometown.
No, actually, and it's true. I think that we just take it for granted that everyone sees things the same and feels the same, but especially back then, because we weren't connected in other than your friends and the people around, you didn't find out what they thought, now everybody sees it on Facebook.
Of course.
And they're friending and unfriending each other and fighting because they didn't realize that it's a different world, I don't know.
It is a different world. And, I learned that, even in the 1960s, there were parts of Corvallis, especially the outskirts, and there was, it's a big farming community too, but there were still a lot of homes with outhouses into the 1960s. And meanwhile, my parents' friends, who were, one family, wealthy physician, I remember we went to their house for, a Christmas party once, and they showed us their bomb shelter they were building. It's just extremes.
Yeah. But that's what, there's always a common fear. I think that people nowadays, they, especially the young ones born in the 90s and 2000s here, they're not going to have a clue how we lived back then about the, the drills about, under your desk or running down to the bomb shelter and all that. People don't have, it's crazy. Nowadays, even the people, there's not a person in grade school that was alive during the 9/11.
And now they're having shooting drills instead of duck and cover drills. They're drills to prepare for a school shooting.
It's crazy. And guns or no guns, I just, even without getting into the politics, we have to wonder why the gun shootings in schools is so prevalent in the U.S. as compared to all the other countries.
Yes, as we know, it's really an American.
Yeah. It's something in the culture. There's something going on in the U.S. that we have these mass shootings. I mean, you would still have them in other countries like Canada and like the UK or Australia, and they have them, but not one every day.
That's true.
So there's something born in the culture that I always question that, and I don't, not even talking about gun legislation or anything like that. It's just kind of, you have to wonder what draws people to do that. And
yeah, and I do think, I've written some about school shootings. We had one in Washington State in 1996. The boy was 14, and he actually the Columbine kids copied him, essentially, and he was one of the young people. He was sentenced to life without parole. He was actually 16 by the time he was sentenced, but then he just got a new sentence because the U.S. Supreme Court said that's cruel and unusual punishment to give a minor life sentence. So instead, he's serving a couple hundred years. But 2,000 young people who were sentenced when they were minors have gotten new sentences. But there's something about the copycat. I think they realize they're going to become well known for a few weeks, a few months.
Yeah.
But I believe home ownership of guns in America exceeds any other country.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's no doubt, and it definitely, the access of the guns there, and that's the first problem, period. I mean, people can say what they want, but it just when you have someone that's unstable for whatever the reason, and they're going to do something like that, having access to guns it makes it easier to plan something like that rather than if you didn't have the guns. So it's common sense, but
it is, and
everything's just gone crazy.
Tribute obviously to teenage suicide rates, and this the boy I'm talking about, Barry Lukaitis in Washington State. He was the last child at home. His parents were in a terribly messy divorce, still living together, and they had guns, and they were hiding the guns from each other, his parents, and it was just, it was just insane. I think it's possible to feel, some sympathy for the kids who.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. It's not funny, but it's strange how back in even the days when this murder in hometown happened and the 70s and stuff, if you remember, the shootings were always in post offices. Remember, everybody would go postal.
Oh, I do. I do remember that. Yeah, the work and the beginning of workplace shootings.
Yeah, and it kind of moved from that into the schools.
Because workplaces began to have more security, I'm sure. I mean, I worked at places. I was in New York for a number of years, and this is a couple decades ago, but boy, it was really tight security, and I believe it is in a lot of places now. Workplace violence still happens, but it has moved to schools.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I said that to some younger people about everything. Someone's gone postal, and they're all looking at me like, "What does that?"
You didn't know.
Yeah, they're like, "What does that mean?"
We could do a trivia book about phrases that are no longer.
Yeah, because it just means nothing. They have no idea. They were
well, and I think part of the interest that I have in Dick Kitchel's murder is that there were no guns. There was no what today. We just had 3 shootings in downtown Seattle in a 24-hour period 2 weeks ago. The same block, and one of them considered a mass shooting. 8 people shot. One died. Yeah. There's not much mystery to a crime like that.
Yeah.
I always like, if you're going to spend 2, 3, 4 years on a book, there needs to be some sort of mystery.
Yeah, there's got to be more to it. Now, what are you working on now? Because this book's already been published and it's out.
Yes, this has been out for years. And I've just finished a book, I think a lot of people will know about this case, about Kyron Horman, who was a 7-year-old and disappeared from his rural grade school near Portland, Oregon, 9.5 years ago. He was living with his father and his stepmother, and his stepmother is certainly a suspect. She's never been officially named a suspect. He has not been found. There's never been a charge or any adjudication in this case. It's an open case. I worked with his mother, interviewed her, hundreds of hours over the last few years. So it'll be the first book about Kyron Horman. And publishers don't always like open cases, but I think readers do. I think they want to know more. I think the book will make news because there's a lot that people don't know about the case, and so it's a pretty big story in the West. But it actually has been revisited over and over by Dr. Phil and Dateline and 2020 and
Nancy Grace.
National attention. So that'll be out in a few months.
Fantastic. Now, do you have a website that people can go to?
I do, and I would love to hear from people, and there's a way to email me on the website, too. So it's Rebecca, middle initial T, Morris.com. Rebecca T. Morris, MORRIS.com.
Fantastic.
And on Facebook, I love to meet people on Facebook.
Oh, dangerous. Well, now we're going to have that up on the website, and we'll have your book up there so people listening can just go one click and pick up the book. And it's been a pleasure. Our guest has been Rebecca Morris, and the book we've been talking about is called A Murder in My Hometown. Thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much, Al. I really love talking to you.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
The mission has been completed.
The end! By George, he's got it! It is the end!
I'll say it.
If you're lying to me, I'll be back.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.